I've called my presentation Plain Packaging 2.0, and when you have a look at this slide, you might think, well, how the heck could you possibly improve on packages that look something like this? Well, fasten your seatbelts. So for the last ride of the conference, we'll go for a quick scan through a couple of different options. So I'd like to start, first of all, just with a very brief reminder of why plain packaging is such an absolutely crucial tobacco control policy. Then I'd like to spend most of my time looking at the 4 ways in which I think it might be possible to extend the measures that have already been taken in Australia. And I'd just like to acknowledge here 2 of the funders, the Health Research Council of New Zealand and New Zealand Heart Foundation, that have supported some of our work. So looking at plain packaging, many of us will already know that smoking experimentation occurs for many reasons. And I think a really crucial reason among those is the fact that young people use branding to construct and then communicate social identities that are very important as they assert themselves in their environments. What we also know is that branding is extremely important to existing smokers because they are continuing a behaviour in an environment that's become increasingly denormalised, and that's a very dissonance-inducing experience for them. So if we use words or look at the studies that Rick Polley has undertaken, you'll see he has a lovely term called the friendly familiarity of branding. And I think that's exactly what branding does for existing smokers. It reassures them in the sea of uncertainty and risk in which they're continuing to perform their behaviour. So packaging does all of this and plays such a key role and is such an important marketing medium because of the way in which it can communicate brand imagery. And I've said young people use those to create and construct social identities, but smokers will also draw on those identities to reduce the feelings of anxiety that continuing to smoke creates. Now, you don't need a degree in marketing. You really don't need much more than a modicum of common sense to look at images like this and recognise that these brands have been very carefully engineered to communicate completely different attributes to important smoker subgroups. And it's this reasoning that explains why Australia's leadership in introducing plain packaging was so absolutely pivotal. And I think what we've heard at this conference and what we've seen from the academic literature certainly is that this is not only pivotal leadership, it is leadership that is working because the evidence is all encouraging. We've heard from Melanie and her team that perceptions and experiences of smoking have declined. We know from Australian government data that both tobacco consumption and smoking prevalence have continued to track downwards despite industry predictions that both would increase. We've seen no evidence of an increase in illicit trade from Michelle Scolo's work. We know from Ron Borland's ITC studies that smokers' support for plain packaging post-implementation has actually increased. And we also know from Melanie's work in observation and monitoring that transaction times did not increase greatly and quickly reverted to earlier levels. So it seems then that what Australia has done is really given us the recipe for success. But I would argue that we've got a great base recipe, but we've always got to look at how we can move on and make what we have even more effective. So I think that there are 4 ways in which we might be able to do this, and I'd just like to run through these very quickly. The first is controlling what's been described as the poetry on a package, and by that I mean the proliferation of variant names that I believe are being used increasingly to try and recreate the connotations that branding or brand imagery once communicated. I also think that we could focus much more on cigarette sticks, or what I call dissuasive sticks. Packages are incredibly important because they are the objects of display, but sticks are the objects of consumption. You cannot smoke without having a stick in your mouth. So we need to focus much more on how these appear and what kind of social identities they can construct. I think we can do a lot more to make warnings far more salient to different population groups, and we have to recognise, unseemly as it may seem, that health messages simply do not resonate for all smoker groups. And finally, I think if we do all of these things, we will greatly increase the dissonance that smokers experience. And if we do that, I think it behoves us also to think about how we can use packages to turn that dissonance into action that supports the cessation we know so many smokers want. So let's look first of all at the descriptors on packages. Now you can see an Australian package here, and I've highlighted both the brand name, and if I'm not sure you can read the descriptor, it says Optimum Crush Sky. Like, really? Optimum Crush Sky? So I think since plain packaging, what we've seen is that variant names have become much more abstract and much more evocative. Now, words like optimum and infinite are incredibly important from a marketing point of view because they are so abstract, and that enables smokers to weave into those words their own stories so that those words become very important to them and another way of creating a brand image and replacing the imagery that's been removed. So as I say, I think it's a blatant attempt to try and recreate aspirational connotations. Now, to try and test that idea, we undertook a small experimental study. I won't go into the details of it. I'll just show the attributes that we tested. We looked at quality descriptors, taste, these more abstract connotations, and colour. And we used what's called a best-worst experiment. And you can see in this question here, we asked people to identify an option they'd be most likely to choose as well as one that they'd be least likely to choose. So in other words, both the best and the worst. And they get a series of choice sets like this, and you can see here some of the different combinations of the attributes that I've just outlined, and from these sets they identify the best and the worst that they would choose. So when we have a look at the results, what we can see is that the abstract descriptor is the most important influence shaping these people's choice behaviours. And the reason for that is because all of the attributes that we tested elicited very positive responses. So with colour, some colours were popular, some not, and you can see that's why that effect looks to be somewhat diminished. We then went on and analysed our data because we wanted to look to see whether there were different choice patterns within the data set. Obviously, if these descriptors were having an effect, we would expect to see some evidence of differential appeals, and that is exactly what we found. Now, if you were to create the ideal brand for each of these segments, you would be creating brands that had quite distinctive attributes. And when we went and looked at some of the attributes of the different segments to try and profile these groups that exhibited the different preferences, what we saw were attributes that were entirely consistent with the choice patterns that we'd identified. So, for example, the daily smokers, much more likely to prefer the red variants, the intermittent smokers, much more likely to prefer the white or the blue descriptors. And we see that when we look at the brands that our participants were already smoking and the descriptors associated with those, a very strong congruence between their choice patterns and the attributes that were having the strongest influence on their behaviour. So what does all of this mean? It means that these words are quite clearly influencing people's choice patterns, and they're doing that by creating points of differentiation that really matter. They're creating salient and attractive attributes. So what can we do about this? Well, as I see it, we have at least two choices. We can freeze the market. We can say at the very point at which we introduce plain packaging legislation, that's it. No more new variant names. If they haven't been in use for 12 months, they're not going to be allowed. So that would retain the status quo. But of course, we always have an opportunity to go beyond that as well. We could say, look, these variants don't discriminate in the harm that they cause. So why on earth should we be allowing them to discriminate in how they present and position themselves? So then the ultimate step, of course, would be to disallow these names on the grounds that all variants are equally lethal. So moving on now to the second intervention, the dissuasive sticks. As I've said, we display packs, but obviously we consume sticks. So our question here was, could we, by changing the appeal of the sticks, alter and decrease the appeal of smoking? And as we all know, smoking is often positioned as being an incredibly attractive, highly desirable kind of experience, and images like this clearly matter a great deal to young people. So what we were trying to do was to completely replace those nice connotations with connotations that instead elicited feelings of disgust and distaste and revulsion. Now, we'd done some early qualitative work where we had looked at the reactions, you've read ahead, at the reactions that some of these more dissuasive sticks that we had constructed elicited. And I mean, if you're in the business of demarketing something, I can tell you it doesn't get any better than getting reactions like slime, scum, vomit, and poo. And the reason, of course, why we got these reactions was because what we were doing was directly fusing these unpleasant connotations, these feelings of dirt and filth with the very act of consumption. So we completely reduced the distance that smokers obviously try to create. And as one young woman said, these colours kind of remind me of death and sickness. It looks like a spew or something. So once again, after having done some preliminary qualitative work, we ran another choice experiment, and here we manipulated the branding level, and you can see some examples there, the warning theme and the warning size, and of course we tested some different stick appearances, and you can see here a stick with the minutes of life lost, the highly unpleasant and aversive green stick, and a stick that we used as a control. Now, again, we had a look at our data and tried to identify different choice patterns, and you can see very clearly here that the three groups we identified did exhibit extremely different choice patterns. So one was very influenced by the stick appearance, one was very influenced by the warning theme, and one equally by the warning theme and the warning size. Now, there are quite a few numbers there. The point that I really want to make is that we used two tests. We used a choice study and we used a rating scale to look at appeal. It didn't really matter what measure we used, the results were exactly the same, and all of the test sticks that we examined were significantly less appealing and less likely to be chosen than the control stick, the white stick with the brown filter. So what can we conclude from this? Well, one thing is that perhaps the actual product is even more important than its packaging. Changing the stick appearance, we can see sharply decreases the appeal of smoking, and I think undermines these efforts to try and sanitise smoking that we know that smokers are engaging in increasingly. So I think another important opportunity to extend plain packaging. Moving on to warning labels, well, we know that health warning labels are incredibly salient with older smokers, and that's precisely because they are experiencing many of the symptoms that are depicted, so they can really empathise with these messages. But I spend a lot of my time talking with young adults. Now, they don't experience very many symptoms at all, and if they do, then they attribute them to other things like being a bit unfit. They see the risks that are presented in warning labels as very uncertain. They think they're extreme, they think they're unrealistic, they think they're very unlikely to happen to them, and that makes it very easy to dismiss them as being irrelevant. And they think these are the sorts of things that happen to old, hardcore smokers. And when you're 20, it's quite difficult to imagine being twice your age at 40. It's even, which is scary, it's even more challenging for them to imagine what it might be like to be 60 and like the man who's shown in the top corner. So for them, their reality of smoking, despite the fact that it is becoming increasingly denormalised, is still something that they view largely as social, occurring in settings that they find enjoyable, and almost invariably paired with alcohol. So I think many of the health warnings that we use at the moment really lack salience to young adults, and that's because they are focused so much on the short term, whereas we're trying to talk to them about the long term. They see many social risks in not smoking in the short term. And they might be things like being isolated from their social networks, being the only person who stays inside in the bar while everybody else goes out for a smoke. And what is it that we are promising them? We're saying, well, you might live a longer and healthier life. That's really not a benefit that they find very salient at the time at which we're communicating it to them. So I'd never heard of hashtag YOLO, but luckily I have a youthful PhD student, and she told me about this. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing here. This emphasis on seizing the moment, carpe diem, because the moment will be gone, so we have to maximise what we get out of it. So to try and explore exactly how we might communicate more effectively with young adults, we ran a series of in-depth interviews. And I'll just show you some of the images here that we used with them. There are two on the screen that were really effective. Any thoughts about what they might be? The money was incredibly effective, and the dogs were very effective as well, because many young people still have the first pet that they had as a child. These are some of the other images that we used. There was one here that was spectacularly unsuccessful. And that was stop. We thought that it was presenting some life barriers that might lie ahead. They saw it as being completely didactic. Young people, we got them to identify their top three, and then we showed them some images, some packs alongside some messages. And these are some examples of what we showed them there, where we tried to compare both health-oriented and more socially, temporally proximal warnings as well. And here are some more examples of that. And what did we find in their responses? I mean, the main response really was this very strong feeling of disgust that came through, and that came through in lots of ways. It was a very physical response. So this young person, I interviewed him, and he was looking at these images. He was saying, oh, that's disgusting. That's disgusting. Oh, my God, that's disgusting. So I put that up there just to show how strongly that emotion came through. But there were also very strong feelings of emotional disgust. And, you know, the kind of question was, how could they possibly do that? I don't want my child to go through what's shown in that. That is disgusting. You know, they didn't create that choice. There were very cognitive feelings of disgust, as in, you know, I can't believe that I'm doing that I'm actually forcing everybody around me to smoke, because actually that's pretty disgusting. And there was also a strong theme of social equity that came through, particularly in images showing child labour. You know, that's forced labour. It's definitely pretty disgusting. And there was a strong theme, as I showed you with the wallet image, of smokers who feel regret, a very strong sense of the waste that was happening. And that image really captured that very nicely. You see this accumulation of the waste and the opportunity cost that's associated with that. So what are some early implications from that? We know young adults know that smoking's harmful. Didactic images, as I said, were very ineffective. But visual impact and emotional arousal, as we already know, were incredibly important. But the emotions that we're looking at perhaps could be extended. Instead of just looking at fear, maybe we need to look at disgust, horror, regret, anger, and even, as some people have said, shame. Now, finally, I just want to outline very quickly some findings from our final study, and this was where we looked at how packs might be used to encourage quitting, because, as I said, if we do all of these things, you know, we might be making smokers feel pretty bad, and we have to give them some solution to those feelings. One way in which we can do that is by making the information about quitting on packs much more visually impactful. Now, this is what the back of a cigarette pack in New Zealand looks like at the moment. If I take that away and my colleagues from Quitline don't say anything, does anybody remember where the Quitline information was or what the New Zealand Quitline number is? It's because it's pretty darn difficult to see. And so we got a graphic artist to recreate what an impactful back of pack might look like, and you can see that shown in the image on the right. Once again, we did another experimental study, and we got people to select between alternative permutations of these redesigned packs, so 2 panels or 3 panels, as you can see shown there. What we see here very clearly are that both the 2-panel packs worked much more effectively than anything else. What you can see on the far right is the control pack, which was quite clearly the very worst performing of all the options that we tested. We also used a heat map and asked people to identify where on the map the aspects of the pack rather that they thought would be most likely to get people to think about quitting. And you can see that in our test one, both the Quitline name and number and the affirming message, you can quit smoking, came through far more strongly. And also, importantly, the people who were most responsive were actually the people we regard as being our higher priority groups. They were older, there were more Māori and Pacific, they had lower education levels and a higher quit likelihood. So really, a PAC has a potential, I think, to function as an agent of change, and it can support, obviously, as well as stimulate cessation. So in conclusion then, I think Australia has provided absolutely fantastic leadership, but we've always got to look at what we should be doing next. And I think about one of my favourite tobacco control researchers, the inspirational Ruth Malone. And what does she say? She is always telling us, imagine things otherwise. I think that's Ruth's challenge. So I think if she were here right now, she would say plain packaging has been a great start in imagining things otherwise. But she would challenge us by saying imagination is infinite. Keep going. So I hope that these studies that I've presented might be a platform that policymakers currently thinking of implementing plain packaging, certainly those in my own country, might adopt, because it's the ultimate opportunity, I think, to re-engineer packs. So just in finishing, I'd like to acknowledge three people without whom none of these studies would have taken place. They are Jordan Louvier, the architect of best-worst scaling or modelling, Christine Eckert, who's also an extraordinary choice modeller in her own right, and Phil Gendel, who is an extremely talented researcher and important for all sorts of other reasons. So kia ora, thank you very much.